The weight of failure often arrives quietly. It isn't dramatic or loud. It sits in the background of your day, unnoticed at first, making mornings heavier and effort feel invisible. You do everything you think is right, yet nothing seems to move forward. Tasks pile up, hope feels distant, and doubt whispers that maybe you're stuck forever. And somewhere nearby, silently observing, is someone who doesn't intervene or lecture, but simply exists. Their quiet presence doesn't fix anything yet, but it changes the air just enough, preparing for a small, almost forgotten habit that will slowly turn everything around. There was a man in the background of all this who never tried to fix anything with words. He didn't give speeches, didn't raise his voice, and didn't ask uncomfortable questions. He simply moved through his days with a calm that felt almost out of place next to all that quiet frustration. This was the Father. He noticed more than he said. When effort went unnoticed and disappointment lingered in the air, he didn't rush in with advice. He didn't say things like, "Be patient" or "Work harder." Instead, he listened without leaning forward, as if trust didn't need to be earned through explanation. That silence wasn't empty, it felt steady. Every morning he followed the same routine, not because he was obsessed with discipline, but because it made sense to him. He woke up, did what needed to be done, and treated ordinary tasks with quiet respect. There was no urgency in him, no visible anxiety about outcomes, just presence. To someone struggling, this kind of calm can feel confusing. It almost feels like indifference until you realize it isn't. It's belief without pressure. He never acted disappointed, even when progress was slow. That absence of judgment made space to breathe. Without saying it out loud, he was teaching something important, that effort didn't need applause, that showing up mattered more than explaining yourself, that consistency could exist without drama. There was one small thing he did every day, almost unnoticed. The same action, at the same time, without fail. No announcement, no explanation, just repetition. At the time, it seemed meaningless. Later, it would quietly become everything. For now, it stayed in the background, waiting patiently, like a seed in dry soil, unseen, unchanged, but quietly prepared to grow when conditions softened without anyone noticing the moment it began. The habit itself was nothing impressive. In fact, most people would have dismissed it immediately. There was no transformation attached to it, no visible reward, no promise of quick results. It didn't look productive in the way people usually define productivity. It was small, quiet, and almost forgettable. Every day, around the same time, the Father would sit down and do this one simple thing. Not for long, not with intensity, just enough to complete it, then move on. No matter how busy the day felt or how ordinary it looked, that moment stayed untouched. It didn't expand, it didn't shrink, it just existed. At first, it was easy to ignore. When you're struggling, you're trained to look for big changes, new plans, new strategies, something dramatic enough to justify hope. This habit offered none of that. It didn't feel like progress, it felt like routine. Yet day after day, it kept happening. The same calm posture, the same steady pace, no rush to finish, no hesitation to start. It wasn't driven by motivation, because motivation comes and goes. It seemed to run on something quieter, something deeper. There was no visible outcome tied to it, no immediate improvement followed. Life didn't suddenly feel lighter, problems didn't disappear, and that's what made it easy to underestimate. Nothing changes when you watch it once, or twice, or even after a week, but repetition has a way of working beneath the surface. The habit began to blend into the daily life, like a ticking clock you stop noticing until the room goes silent. Its power wasn't in what it produced, but in the fact that it never disappeared. At the time, it felt almost pointless. Why do something so small when everything feels so heavy? Why repeat something that doesn't seem to move the needle? Those questions lingered, unanswered. The habit continued anyway, unaffected by doubt or impatience, quietly proving that not all meaningful change announces itself when it arrives, and some things only begin working long before they are understood. It's hard to believe in small things when everything else feels like it's falling apart. When failure has been quietly building, even the simplest action can feel meaningless. You do it once, then again, and nothing seems to change. That's when doubt creeps in. Maybe this is pointless. Maybe it's not worth the effort. Maybe nothing will ever work. This is the invisible barrier most people hit when they're struggling. You're trained to chase results, to see progress, to measure success. So when a habit doesn't produce a visible outcome immediately, it feels like a waste. And that feeling isn't weakness. It's human. It's the mind trying to protect you from disappointment, even if it misfires. You start questioning yourself. Why bother showing up if no one notices? Why commit to something that seems too small to matter? You imagine the world as a race and your small actions as insignificant steps that don't count. It's exhausting because the more you question, the heavier the weight of failure feels. You want shortcuts, instant fixes, a moment where you can finally say, "Yes, I've arrived." But the truth is, the most meaningful changes rarely announce themselves. They grow quietly, in repetition, in patience, in consistency that no one applauds. Your resistance isn't wrong. It's a sign that you care. And your doubts aren't shameful. They're part of being aware, sensitive, and alive. What's fascinating is that this quiet resistance doesn't stop the habit. The small action continues, unshaken by judgment, unbothered by impatience. And slowly, imperceptibly, it begins to build something you can't yet see. That's the paradox. The moment feels pointless because the results aren't ready. Yet, just by persisting, you are laying the foundation for everything that's about to follow. Something shifted, though it didn't feel like a breakthrough. There were no fireworks, no sudden moments of clarity, no grand signs that life had changed overnight. One morning, the protagonist noticed something small. A task that used to feel heavy now felt lighter. Not easy, not effortless, just manageable. A subtle relief, barely perceptible like sunlight filtering through clouds after a long storm. Days passed, and more of these small, almost invisible shifts appeared. Decisions that once caused anxiety were approached with quiet confidence. Mornings were still early, the days still demanding, but there was a slight ease in the way tasks were handled. Nothing dramatic had changed externally, yet something inside was different. The frustration that had clung like a shadow began to loosen. The father's habit, repeated without fanfare, had begun to take root in ways the protagonist couldn't yet articulate. There was a rhythm forming, a sense that showing up mattered even when no one else noticed. The habit itself hadn't created instant success, but it had changed something internal: patience, consistency, trust in the process. Small victories, unnoticed by anyone else, were happening every day. It was easy to miss. That's why most people give up before change takes hold. They wait for signs that are too big to arrive, for progress that feels visible and dramatic, and when it doesn't appear, they quit. But real change doesn't always feel impressive. Sometimes it's subtle, quiet, uneventful. Yet these moments accumulate, quietly stacking, until one day you look back and realize that the landscape of your life has shifted. At this stage, external success hadn't arrived. The world didn't notice. But internally, the protagonist began to sense that they were capable of more than they had believed. The mind, once weighed down with doubt, now moved with a subtle sense of possibility. And while nothing flashy had happened yet, this invisible transformation was preparing the stage for everything that was about to follow. What the father was teaching had little to do with the task itself. It wasn't about efficiency, output, or checking boxes. The lesson lay in how he moved through the world, the quiet confidence of someone who trusted himself enough to show up every day, even when no one was watching. That trust wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady, reliable, and entirely internal. Watching him, the protagonist began to realize that habits aren't just about results. They are mirrors reflecting who we are becoming in the process. Repetition, consistency, and patience quietly shape character long before they shape circumstance. The father's silent actions were a demonstration of identity, someone who doesn't wait for permission, applause, or recognition to do what matters. He showed that progress begins inside, long before it appears outside. This was the kind of wisdom that doesn't hit like a revelation. It seeps in. You notice it in the way he carries himself, in the calm rhythm of his days, and in the absence of panic when things don't go as planned. The protagonist began to see that this quiet form of guidance was far more powerful than any loud advice or motivational speech. It wasn't telling them what to do, it was showing them how to trust themselves. The father's actions were deceptively simple, yet beneath that simplicity lay a profound truth. Transformation begins with consistency, patience, and belief in your own small steps. Success is the byproduct of becoming someone who shows up even when the results aren't visible yet. This understanding reframed everything. The habit that seemed ordinary suddenly felt like a blueprint for growth, not growth of skill or wealth, but growth of self, of confidence, of resilience. And that's the moment where realization begins to shift into action. Understanding alone doesn't change life, but seeing that quiet trust, witnessing its subtle power, plants the first seed of something the protagonist can now choose to carry forward, daily, patiently, and without fanfare. The most surprising change wasn't visible at all. The world hadn't shifted, deadlines hadn't disappeared, and opportunities hadn't magically appeared. Yet internally, something was transforming. The protagonist felt a quiet confidence building, a sense that they could handle more than they had believed. It wasn't arrogance or sudden skill, it was trust in themselves, in the fact that showing up consistently mattered, even if no one else noticed. Discipline became less of a struggle. Tasks that once felt heavy were now approached with calm intention. The mind, previously cluttered with doubt and frustration, began to settle. There was space to think, to plan, to act without panic. It was a subtle rhythm, like the slow beating of a heart, constant, unnoticed, yet life-giving. Each day of following the habit reinforced the belief that effort had value, independent of recognition or immediate results. This quiet reconstruction of confidence is one of the most underappreciated parts of personal growth. Many people chase visible victories and forget that internal stability comes first. The protagonist discovered that by simply showing up, faithfully, patiently, they were quietly rebuilding a foundation no external event could provide. Fear of failure softened. Self-doubt loosened its grip. Even mistakes began to feel less threatening, less defining, because there was now a steady baseline to return to. The habit itself hadn't created success in the outside world yet, but it had done something more essential. It had taught self-trust. The protagonist no longer needed constant reassurance from results, others' opinions, or quick fixes. They were learning to rely on the consistency of their own actions, and that consistency created a quiet power, a readiness for opportunities that hadn't existed before. And then, almost imperceptibly, the world began to respond. Doors started to open, moments of recognition appeared, not because the habit changed reality directly, but because the protagonist had changed. Confidence, patience, and calm, once internal, began shaping choices and actions in ways that would eventually ripple outward. Success was still ahead, but the most important victory had already been won. Belief in the ability to keep going, to show up, and to quietly, steadily build a life that mattered. The change didn't announce itself. There were no celebrations, no sudden breakthroughs. One morning, the protagonist realized that something had shifted in the world around them. Tasks that used to feel daunting now moved smoothly. People began noticing effort that had once gone unseen. Opportunities arrived not as miracles, but as natural extensions of the steady work that had quietly been happening all along. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and that was part of its power. The world hadn't transformed overnight. The same challenges existed, the same uncertainties lingered, but the protagonist felt prepared, capable, and aligned in a way they hadn't before. Success had arrived not as a spectacle, but as a gentle confirmation that persistence, patience, and self-trust truly matter. There was a strange satisfaction in realizing that the external result was never the main point. It had always been about the quiet internal growth, the calm, consistent habit that had rebuilt confidence, focus, and resilience. The moment didn't need applause. It simply existed, fully present, and deeply earned. And in that quiet arrival, the lesson was clear. Meaningful change doesn't shout, it whispers. And those who listen carefully, those who stay steady even when the world seems indifferent, are the ones who discover it. The truth is, you don't need to overhaul your life to create meaningful change. You don't need grand plans, expensive courses, or dramatic rituals. All it takes is one small, consistent habit, a tiny act of showing up for yourself each day. It could be as simple as writing a few lines in a journal, making your bed, or spending 5 minutes quietly reflecting. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that it belongs to you, that it's done regularly, and that it's done without pressure or expectation. The power of this small action lies not in instant results, but in what it builds quietly over time. Confidence grows, focus sharpens, self-trust strengthens, and before you notice it, the world begins to respond. Not because the habit is flashy, but because you've changed internally. You are practicing patience, discipline, and respect for your own growth, and that foundation becomes unshakable. You don't need to chase massive transformations. You don't need to force motivation. Start small, start today, and let consistency do the rest. Your life isn't a race, and success isn't always loud. Some of the most powerful shifts happen silently in habits that seem insignificant at first. By choosing one small act and honoring it, you are quietly building a life you can trust, a life that reflects patience, care, and the kind of calm resilience that lasts long after excitement fades.